You know, the great lesson of anthropology is the idea that the world into which you were born doesn't exist in some absolute sense, but is just one model of reality, the consequence of one particular set of adaptive choices that your lineage made, however successfully, many generations ago. And the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being you, or in our case, failed attempts at modernity. They are by definition unique facets of the human imagination. And when asked the meaning of being human, they respond with 6,000 different voices. And those voices collectively become the human repertoire for dealing with the challenges that will confront us in the ensuing millennia. You know, we always have this this idea of our society as not being really a culture, but being the real world, and these other cultures are outside there. Those are the cultures. But that kind of cultural myopia we really can no longer afford. And, you know, we aren't the real inexorable wave of history. We're just another set of possibilities. We're just another cultural reality with choices that we've made. And that's why in the whole realm of child rearing and education, I think it behooves us to look at models of enculturation, of initiation, of bringing children to the realm of adulthood that other societies have celebrated and developed over thousands of years of experience.
There is no doubt that if we look honestly at the traditional forms of education and compare them to today's modern education system, that the traditional forms of knowledge fostered sustainability. All these cultures were not perfect, but they did know about their own specific climate, soil, water, and they did manage to survive independently, in charge of their own lives, for generation after generation. In the modern economy and with the modern educational system, the children learn nothing about that, but instead they learn how to use essentially corporate products in an urban consumer culture. So once they've been educated in modern schools, they literally don't know how to survive in their own environment.
Education is not simply the transmission of information. It's by definition the transmission and indeed the enculturation, or one could say more harshly, the indoctrination of a child into a certain way of knowing, a way of learning, a way of being. And again, when we project our notions of what education is or what a way of being is overseas into other people's lives, we forget that we're projecting just something that we made up, right? And one of the things that I see in my work is that different ways of knowing, different ways of being, different ways of learning really create different human beings. If you're raised in Colorado to believe that a mountain is an inert pile of rock waiting to be mined, you're going to have a very different relationship to that mountain from a kid from southern Peru who believes in the fiber of his being that a mountain is an Apu spirit, a protective deity that will direct his destiny throughout life. Now, the interesting observation is not whether that mountain is in fact a spirit or whether it's just a pile of dirt. The interesting observation is how the education system into what that mountain is creates a different human being with a different relationship to the earth. I was raised in the forests of British Columbia to believe that those forests existed to be cut. That was the foundation of the ideology of scientific forestry that I was taught in school and that I practiced as a logger in the woods. It was based on the idea that we had to eliminate all the old growth to get some healthy plantations growing in their wake, because after all, the incremental addition of cellulose would be higher in a plant. I mean, but this was a construct. But critically, that belief system made me a very different human being with a very different relationship to that forest than my friends from native communities who believed that that forest was the abode of Hukuk and the crooked beak of heaven. Because of my ideology, my education, those forests no longer exist.
I think the way Western education has grown over the last few centuries, especially with the rise of industrialization, was basically not to create human beings fully equipped to deal with life and all its problems, independent citizens able to exercise their decisions and live their responsibilities in community, but elements to feed into an industrial production system. They were products with partial knowledge. We moved from wisdom to knowledge, and now we are moving from knowledge to information, and that information is so partial that we are creating incomplete human beings.
If we look back at the beginning of so-called education, the agenda was very clear. There was an elite that wanted to train people to serve their needs, to essentially create an extractive economy that served the few at the expense of the many. So there's very explicit literature. Very clearly education was there to train a class of people to serve the needs of the elite.
When Macaulay came to India, I don't know how many of you know, but Macaulay was the guy who created in the minutes of Macaulay, it's called Macaulay's Children. And Macaulay's children, he said, would be brown on the outside but white on the inside. That they would basically know only one thing, how to rule India as if they were Europeans themselves.
So if you go back to the 60s and you look at a lot of the modernization literature, so it's very clearly written that local language, local tradition, local customs is a barrier to modernization, and for communities to progress in kind of stages of development, these things need to be eliminated.
99% of all the activities that go under the label of education come from this very specific agenda that grew out of a colonial expansion across the world by Europeans. And now in different countries in the so-called third world, the basic fundamental agenda is the same, is to pull people into dependence on a modern centralized economy, is to pull them away from their independence and from their own culture and self-respect.
There's actually a very big global program that is going on right now called Education for All. And it is, every person I've met who is associated with has basically no questions around its agenda or attention, which is very disturbing. It's a program which is sanctioned by every government in the world. It's a program which the World Bank and the UN agencies support. It's a program that corporations are also now, major corporations, McDonald's and many others are also behind. And the agenda of the program is to get every child into school. The claim is that, again, by going to school, communities will be able to develop and they'll be able to become part of the mainstream society. Now, I think we need to question what does it mean to become part of the mainstream today. And that, for me, is very, very much tied to a very clear agenda of becoming part of the global economy and shifting one's own local economy, one's own local culture, one's own local resources, both personal as well as collective, into the service of the global economy.
So you will find prime ministers and presidents of countries regularly saying, we have got to change our education system to make us more competitive in the global economy. That means we have got to train our young people so that they will suit the needs of giant mobile corporations.
Well, the Education for All initiative is an attempt to redress what was seen as a serious imbalance in funding for primary education. The intent really is to get every child into school. I think we see education as crucial. It's an absolutely necessary condition for sustained poverty reduction. The demand now for education is not just coming from people like the World Bank and outsiders. It's coming from businessmen who are discovering that they can't grow their factories because they can't grow their businesses because there's a shortage of skilled workers. So we need to be very careful about not being paternalistic to so-called ancient cultures. We can help them and certainly not ruin or try to wreck their own cultures. But on the other hand, I think we should be careful about trying to preserve their culture in kind of cold storage. If they don't want that, we should be there to help them.